I think what the grounds for optimism is how schools have carried on well in terms of COVID, and learning has continued. As I said before, trust has been gained in schools and of education systems, and that's a huge gain, I think. And it has put, COVID has put hospital workers and schools and, hospitals and schools at the core of public policy, as well as health responses and education responses are very important. And I think that is a gain for all of us. And I saw here that the need to depoliticize education, and this may have actually contributed to hopefully depoliticizing education. The concern is that people are tired, and how do you, and again with a third and a fourth, so how do you give them the positiveness for the future to continue, not to erode all the efforts that they're putting in there? And I think giving them the longer term perspective of the value of education and schools and the role that they're playing and how important that is very, very important. And I think I don't hear that much. I just hear criticism and what we need to do now, but actually, oh my God, they're really doing a great job. It appears sometimes, but keeping that with a longer term perspective. And then the other one is the data. We are, from the OECD, is a data-driven organization, but one of the issues is that as assessments are changing, and it's not very clear, are students supposed to continue learning the same curriculum, the same amount of material in half the time when they're in school? And how do you measure their progress? And this is something that many education systems still don't know. And they only know maybe when they start the school year in September, when they find that there's a lot of gaps. And so understanding where students are and alerting the system is very, very important, because we are doing the effort, but do we know that they're learning? And are the assessments that we're using effective enough to understand whether students have accomplished what we set on course to get accomplished? And I think that's an issue that's quite important now to target.
What concerns me, although it's entirely understandable, is we're still almost in a period of crisis leadership in many education systems. And I think that's understandable. But as we look to the upcoming school year, it's not sustainable. So we need to think about how we reconfigure leadership. The pieces that Beatrice has spoken about, that short term versus the urgent. I think the temptation will be to go back to the old status quo, but we're seeing quite clearly that there were problems with the status quo, and they've brought even more sharply now into COVID, whether it's equity or well-being or technology or assessment. So I think my optimism is quite clear what we need to address. I think there's a lot of consensus about what we need to address. So you identify the problem and then you take action on the problem. So I think we can move forward with a professional education system because everyone has had to step up, and where we trust and we collaborate, things have worked mostly, preferably, and better. And I think to some of the points that were raised earlier, politicians, the public now fully recognise the importance of schools. So let's build on that. Research studies and data that are showing about growing workload and work intensification, not only for teachers, I mean for school leaders as well, possibly for everyone who works in education. And I think obviously we tend to focus on students, and that's correct. However, if you have teachers or school leaders who really are overstretched, exhausted, dealing with mental health issues, that is just an unhealthy environment for everyone. So students are not going to flourish in those circumstances. So I think the more that the evidence is provided, the more it's recognised, the more compelling it has to become. Because during the pandemic and whatever coming out of it looks like, there's going to be an exhausted education workforce, and there's going to be students whose learning and equity issues need attention. So we have to look at both in parallel. Any system leaders or governments that don't look in parallel are going to struggle with improving their education system. So whether you do it for the well-being of the profession, or for students, or for a functioning education system, it has to be dealt with. It can't be ignored or seen as less important or lower down the priorities. The two need to be taken together.
Well, I agree with Carol that it needs to be tackled, that it's an issue for the profession more generally, and that it is coming through much more strongly in terms of COVID. And I think to a number of responses, there are a number of issues here, I think, on the teaching workforce that need to be tackled more systemically than what's happening now, you know. And I don't know if any of you in your own education systems, do you have a task force to analyze, you know, what are the current struggles of the teaching workforce? People now have valued it more. What are teachers doing, what's working, what's not, and how you would need to change the teaching contracts in a way, or the workload issue and the time and the technology to be able to handle this new hybrid environment, I think. And so developing this, possibly with teacher unions, bringing another of the questions in there, you know, who deals with a lot of labor issues, having a different perspective of what the teaching profession could look like in terms of labor issues in relation to technology, to workload balance, to expectations, would be quite important. Developing a task force to shape what teaching would need to look like and how it would need to be supported in the future. If education needs to stay in these current conditions, you need to have a more systemic response than.
So the great answer you're saying there, Beatrice, is rather than officials sitting in their offices working out how to engage teachers and do their well-being, talk to teachers, get them to help to solve some of those problems.
Yes, and develop systematic responses to that.
Carol, anything on the unions and teacher union issue that's up here? That anything you want to say about how we can, what the role of teacher unions can be in these times?
Well, I not that I claim to know what's happening in every education system around the world, but the education systems that are being held up as navigating through the pandemic more smoothly have been those ones where there seems to have been genuine collaboration between government and the education profession, including teacher unions, but also other professional associations where those exist. So I think that in the best case scenarios, teacher unions are welcome partners by the government, that they're, as Beatrice has said in the last answer, you know, they're part of whatever the task force or collaborative groups are, and there's genuine sharing and discussion and communication. And of course, there'll be honest disagreements. There's always going to be. So that's the best case scenario. However, what we are seeing now, you know, there's things happening in Chicago today as I'm following the news, that in some cases teacher unions are also having to be the people that are standing up and saying these are school conditions are unsafe for staff and students. So there's certainly an advocacy role around the profession and well-being. I think teacher unions have obviously I work with teacher unions, they have an important voice, they need to be part of this, they need to be constructively part of this. Governments need to look to them as partners, whether there's agreements or disagreements, but at this moment in time, we all need to be talking to each other, sharing information, trying to work our way through. There's not one partner that has all the answers, and the better solution is to co-develop and to genuinely engage with each other.
I think at the heart is, there's also another question about autonomy. And, you know, schools have demonstrated that they have the capacity to respond, and school leaders need to be in the middle, shaping the responses for schools. And so policymakers, many of you have done this already, provide clear guidelines, first of all, to protect school leaders in the decisions that they make, and to give a clear understanding of what need to be the priorities, because you know, you're asking for them to take care of every single problem that society has in schools. So you ask them to take care of the well-being of all their kids, where that's unfair, in fact. If you ask them to teach, to take care of welfare, to feed them, to have all the right support for all, every possible problem that goes around schools, they have to take care of it on the ground. And it's a very large demand for them. So I think governments need to prioritize and have a clear vision and provide it on what is the purpose of schools, what do they need to be teaching, and what schools and students need to be learning. And I think that's one of the issues about assessment. You first have to clarify what will be for this year. You know, do you want schools to be teaching the whole curriculum, or only for subject areas with selected skills, so that school leaders have a clear idea of where to take their schools towards? And so preparing the right guidelines, the right on health and on learning, on curriculum issues, and then giving them the right support in terms of funding, in terms of materials, in terms of health. Because what we hear from the ground is that many schools actually don't comply because they can't. The government sends them a guideline. You have to have rooms where you can only fit X amount of students in the room, and they don't have anywhere else to teach the kids. So they don't have space, they don't have, you know, the rooms, they don't have the teachers to double up their courses, so they cannot deliver, and they are, you know, professionally responsible for the teaching and learning of all their kids. So they group all the kids inside one class, whether the guideline is, they can't really follow the guidelines. So you need to make sure that they have support in order to be able to follow the guidelines, or otherwise to give them the right resources to be able to do so. I think that's quite important, to always put yourselves in the feet of principals, in the shoes of principals, to know what their daily struggles are and how you can help them, rather than, you know, having this your own vision, but working with them directly.
I agree with all of Beatrice's points. I think, as we've been saying about teacher unions, you know, school principals organizations need to be in close conversation and communication with government, and sometimes they're within the teacher union, sometimes they're separate, but there needs to be an understanding and respect of the day-to-day experiences of the people that work in our schools in forming decisions. I think governments, both for school leaders and also on the sort of local autonomy question, governments need to provide a clarity of direction and some consistency around that direction. And I realize that's challenging in a pandemic when things are changing dramatically, but you know, it's of course difficult for school leaders to navigate when they don't necessarily know from one week to the next week exactly what the government direction is going to be. So clarity of direction, support for the development. It takes capacity to build, capacity to lead. So, you know, as most education systems have, leadership development frameworks, investment in leadership, recruitment and development. You can't have autonomy without having the capacity to lead within that context. And that takes investment in professional learning, recruitment, retention, development. And I think being clear on what the strategic policies are, the overall curriculum framework, the assessment framework, but not micromanaging. At this moment in time, we need local flexibility to deal with the wide range of issues that are affecting students.
I think that at the core is learning how to lead in world of uncertainty, and that requires skills actually for you as well. So it requires practice, and I think you have had the opportunity to practice now, and this is something that may become the new normal. So learning how to lead in uncertainty, how to respond to all of these questions that you are posing actually, and how to have the right processes in order to respond. And the other one is to always have a plan B. If you have a plan A, the chances that it will happen are 50-50. So always offer a plan B or think of a plan B, so that there are possibilities of thinking alternatively. And that will, I don't know, provide a greater safety in a way, a safety net. So I think, for example, Norway worked. What I heard is that Norway had all their schools had to have emergency plans. And so when COVID came, they were ready on the next day because they had practiced, and all schools have to have an alternative plan in case of an emergency. And this worked really well. So not only for schools, but possibly for all schools to have this. So for the national government to develop the vision, the clear guidelines, the support, and for schools to have, clarity themselves on what they need to be delivering and the right support, and a plan B in case things don't work as planned, so that they can continue.
Effective leadership at all levels really matters, and that includes the leadership of the people that are part of this ARC conversation. Your leadership matters. Nobody can do this on their own, and no level of the education system can do this on their own. So the opportunities for collaboration, for joint decision-making, co-development, co-planning, as Beatrice said, these are uncertain times, but there are people in your system who will have knowledge and expertise. That might be you, but you're going to have to also draw on other people. So your leadership matters, and collaborative leadership really matters. And that matters for, all the things Beatrice has talked about, the strategic direction, the policies. But so much of what came up in the word clouds in the conversation are about trust and empathy and communication and listening. So, I always want to talk about the humanity in education. So let's remember that the people matter. You matter, and the people you're dealing with matter. And the education systems that have been higher performing, more successful, are those that simultaneously invest in the education profession as well as student success strategies and initiatives. We need to do both. Students absolutely matter. We need to invest in students, but you can't get there without also investing in leadership development and in the education profession and in professional learning. And I saw some of the questions about austerity. COVID came on top of austerity in many education systems, and we know there's going to be an economic impact. But people have recognized the value of schools for all sorts of different reasons. People are concerned about schools being closed. And we know that we have to have this generation not be a generation that's in crisis, but a generation that are going to lead the way forward. We're seeing results around students themselves learning empathy, having a new sort of global awareness. So we absolutely have to invest in the education system. The temptation will be more austerity, and then within the budget to cut the parts that are linked to the profession rather than directly to students. But actually we need all of that to work coherently in parallel. So thank you for your leadership, and thank you for leading in collaboration with humanity and a duty of care.